June 12th. We have had 3 days of horrible weather when a moment that promised a continued fine induced the emperor to take an airing in his carriage. He had just finished reading the history of the Constituent Assembly by Rabot de Saint-Étienne. He entertained very nearly the same opinion of this writer as of Lecretel. He then took occasion to notice several characters. Puis, he said, was not a bad man, but unquestionably a miserable politician. Lafayette was another simpleton, and by no means formed for the eminent character he wished to represent. His political simplicity was such that he could not avoid being the constant dupe of men and things. All was lost in my return from Waterloo by his insurrection of the chambers. Who could have persuaded him that I had arrived merely for the purpose of dissolving them? I, whose only safety was centered in them. One of the parties saying, by way of excuse or extenuation, it was, however, sire, the same man who, treating afterwards with the allies, was filled with indignation at their proposal of delivering up your majesty, and eagerly asked if it was, too, the prisoner of Olmutz. They dared to address themselves, but sir, replied the emperor, you run from one subject to another, rather you concur with, instead of opposing my opinion. I have not attacked the sentiments or intentions of Monsieur de Lafayette. I've only complained of their fatal results. The emperor then continued in the same way to review the leading men of that period. He dwelt at considerable length on the affair of Favre's. Besides, observed the emperor, nothing was more common than the fine men of that epoch, quite the reverse in character of that which their words and actions seemed to establish. Monge, for example, might be considered a terrible man. When war was resolved upon, he declared from the tribune of the Jacobins that he would give his 2 daughters in marriage to the first 2 soldiers who might be wounded by the enemy. This he was at liberty to do in the strictest sense of the gift as far as it respected himself, but he maintained that others should be compelled to follow his example and that all the nobility should be put to death. Yet Monge was one of the mildest and weakest men living and would not allow a chicken to be killed if he were obliged to do it himself or to see it done. This furious Republican, as he believed himself, cherished, however, a kind of worship for me, which he pushed to adoration. He loved me as one loves his mistress. Gregoire, whose animosity to the clergy whom he wished to bring back to their original simplicity was so great that he might have passed for a champion of irreligion, may be mentioned as another instance. Yet Gregoire, when the revolutionists were denying their God and abolishing the priesthood, was very nearly being massacred in mounting the tribune for the purpose of boldly declaring his religious sentiments and protesting that he would die a priest. At the very moment when the work of destruction was going on in all the churches against the altars, Gregoire erected one in his own apartment and said mass there every day. This man's lot, however, is decidedly cast. If he be driven from France, he must take refuge in Saint Domingo. The friend, the advocate, the eulogist of the Negroes will be a god or a saint among them. Saint Domingo naturally became the next subject of our conversation. I had in my younger days seen that colony in its most flourishing state. The emperor put many questions to me and made himself acquainted with all the circumstances relating to that remote period. When his inquiries were over, he said, I shall no doubt astonish you, but I'm convinced, even from your own statements, that the island has not at this moment lost a third, certainly not 1/2 of its value, and that in a short time it will recover all its former prosperity. I should not in reality be surprised at it, for all the absurd stories circulated in Europe respecting France are to be put us on our guard against those which might be safely told with regard to Saint Domingo. The emperor said that after the Restoration, the French government had sent out emissaries and proposals which were laughed at by the Negroes. As to myself, he added, on my return from the Isle of Elba, I would have settled all differences with them. I would have recognized their independence, contented myself with some factories like those on the coast of Africa, endeavored to draw them closer to the mother country, and establish a kind of family commerce with them, which might, in my opinion, have been easily accomplished. I have to reproach myself with the attempt made upon the colony during the consulship. The design of reducing it by force was a great error. I ought to have been satisfied with governing it through the medium of Toussaint. peace with England was not sufficiently consolidated, and the territorial wealth I should have acquired by its reduction would have served but to enrich our enemies. He observed, a greater reason to reproach himself with the attempt because he had foreseen its failure, and it was executed against his inclination. He had solely yielded to the opinion of the Council of State, and his ministers, hurried along as they are by the clamors of the colonists, who formed a considerable party at Paris, and were, besides, he said, either nearly all royalists or in the pay of the English faction. The emperor assured us that the army which had been sent out consisted but of 16,000 men and was quite sufficient. The failure of the expedition was solely to be attributed to accidental circumstances, such as the yellow fever, the death of the commander-in-chief, a new war. Toussaint observed, the emperor was not a man destitute of merit, but he certainly was not so highly gifted as was attempted in his time to describe him. His character, besides, was ill calculated to inspire real confidence. He had given us serious causes of complaint. It would have been necessary to always be distrustful of his sincerity. He was chiefly guided by an officer of engineers or artillery. That officer had come to France before Leclerc's expedition, and conferences were for a long time held with him. He exerted himself very much to prevent the attempt, and described with great precision all its difficulties, without pretending, however, that it was impossible. The emperor thought that the Bourbons might succeed in reducing St. Domingo by force, but on that subject the result of arms was not to be calculated upon. It was rather the result of commerce and of grand political views. 300 or 400 millions of capital swept away from France to a remote country, an indefinite period for reaping the fruits of such sacrifice. The very great certainty of seeing them engrossed by the English or swallowed up by revolutions, those were the points for consideration. The emperor concluded with saying that the colonial system, which we have witnessed, is closed for us, as well as the whole continent of Europe. We must give it up, and henceforth confine ourselves to the free navigation of the seas, and the complete liberty of universal barter. The history of the convention, of which Napoleon had already expressed his disapprobation, again presented itself to his thoughts. He was far from being satisfied with La Cretelle. Sentences in abundance, he repeated, and but little coloring, no depth. He is an academician, but in no respect a historian. He made me call my son and dictated the two following notes, of which I give a literal copy, however imperfect they may be, for he never read them a second time. Note 1. The convention called together by a law the Legislative Assembly to form a new constitution for France decreed the Republic. Not that the most enlightened did not think the Republican system incompatible with the existing state of matters in France, but because the monarchy could not be continued without placing the Duke of Orleans on the throne, which would have alienated a great part of the nation. And executive power, consisting of 5 ministers, was established by the convention for conducting the affairs of the Republic. 2 parties contended for the ascendancy in the National Convention. That of the Girondists, composed of men who had influenced the Legislative Assembly, and that of the Mountain, formed by the Commune of Paris, which had directed the atrocities of the 10th of August and the 2nd of September, and commanded the population of the capital. Vergniaud, Brissot, Condorcet, Cadet, and Roland were the leaders of the Girondists. Danton, Robespierre, Marat, Collot, Derbois, and Biot-Varenne headed the Mountain. These 2 parties were alike indebted for their rise to the principles of the Revolution. Their conductors sprang out of the popular societies, which they had successfully rendered subservient to their views. The party of the Girondists was more powerful in talents, and was eminently popular in the great provincial towns, particularly at Bordeaux, Montpellier, Marseille, Caen, Lyon. The party of the mountain possessed more energy and enthusiasm and was no less popular in the capital. And among the clubs of the departments, the Girondist party, which in the Legislative Assembly had been the most ardent for the Revolution, became in the convention the most moderate because it had to contend there with a faction much more violent than itself, which had not found its way into the Assembly. The Girondists called their adversaries the faction of September, and constantly reproached them with the horrible massacre of which they were guilty. They accused them of being hostile to every kind of National Assembly and of endeavoring to transfer the government of France to the Commune of Paris. But by these means, the Girondists only excited against themselves the Jacobins of all departments. On its side, the Commune of Paris, the mountaineers, stigmatized the Girondists by the name of the Federalists and charged them with the design of establishing a federative system in France similar to that of Switzerland. They also accused them of endeavoring to stir up the provinces against the capital, thus held them up to the detestation of the people of Paris, which could maintain its splendor only by the union and unity of the whole of the territory. When the Girondists invaded against the mountaineers for the massacres of the 2nd of September, the latter reproached the former with having, during the Legislative Assembly, rashly and without cause, declared war against all Europe. The Girondists at first appeared to have the upper hand in the convention, and they directed that Marat should be brought to trial and that proceedings should be instituted against the assassinations of September. But Marat, supported by Jacobins and the Commune of Paris, was acquitted by the Revolutionary Tribunal and returned in triumph to the bosom of the Assembly. The trial of the king had been another apple of discord. The two parties seemed to proceed in unison and voted, it is true, for his death, but the greater part of the Girondists also voted for an appeal to the people, and here it is difficult to comprehend the reason of their conduct during that crisis. If they wished to save the king, they were at liberty to do so. They had only to vote for deportation, exile, or the adjournment of the question, but to sentence him to death and make his fate depend upon the will of the people was in the highest degree absurd and impolitic. They seemed to be desirous that after the extinction of the monarchy, France should be torn to pieces by civil war. The general opinion since the commencement of the Revolution that the most audacious and unreasonable faction would always predominate was, from that moment, verified. The Girondists, however, maintained the contest with courage and very often had majorities in the Assembly during all the months of March, April, and May. But the party of the mountaineers had recourse in these circumstances to an expedient which it had constantly employed. On the 31st of May, the fate of the Girondists was decided by an insurrection of the sections of Paris. 27 were arrested, brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal, and sentenced to death. 73 were thrown into prison, and from that period, the triumphant mountain had no obstacles to surmount in the convention. Several Girondist deputies took refuge, however I can, and they raised the standard of insurrection. Lyon, Marseille, Bordeaux, Montpellier, and several towns of Brittany embraced the cause of this party and also took up arms against the convention. All these unconnected efforts were of no avail against the capital, and the mountain remained in tranquil possession of the National Tribune, a circumstance altogether singular contributed to confirm the preponderance of Paris. It was the assignats, then the only resource for supplying the treasury. Not a single tax was unpaid. The provinces learned with considerable emotion the event of the 31st of May and the death of the most celebrated characters of the Girondist party. The armies were not agitated by these results. They took no share in the insurrection of some provinces and remained all attached to the convention and the dominant party of Paris. When the partial insurrection of certain towns in favor of the Girondists was known, all the armies had already taken the oath and testified their adhesion to the mountain. Besides, in the eyes of Frenchmen, Paris was France. Neither did the departments of Alsace, La Moselle, La Flandre, La Franche-Comté, and Dauphiné, where the principal force of the Republic are quartered, sympathize with the feelings of the Federalist towns. The 31st of May deprived France of men of great talents, zealously attached to liberty and the principles of the Revolution. The catastrophe might afflict the well-disposed, but could not surprise them. It was impossible for an assembly which had extricated France from the critical situation to which she was reduced to carry on public business with two parties so inveterately and irreconcilably opposed. It was necessary for the safety of the Republic that one should extinguish the other, and there can be no doubt that had the Girondists obtained the victory, they would have consigned their adversaries to the scaffold. The emperor, who had dictated in his usual way from memory alone without any research, whether he was little satisfied with the task he had executed or for some other reason, stopped here for the purpose, as he said, of recommencing a new dictation on the same subject. Note 2. The convention was established in September 1792 and terminated in October 1795. Its reign, which lasted nearly 3 years, presents 4 eras. The first, from its commencement to the 31st of May 1793, epoch of the destruction of the Girondists. The second, to March 1794, overthrow of the Commune of Paris. The third, to July 1794, fall of Robespierre. The 4th to the 14th Vendemiaire, 4th October 1795. Installation of the government of the Directory. Its first era consisted of 8 months. Its second of 10. Its third of 4. Its fourth of 14. Total, 3 years. During its first era, the convention was constantly divided between the parties of the Mountain and the Gironde. Danton, Robespierre, Marat, Collot, Derbois, Biot, Varenne, Carnot, Hérault, de Seychelles were the leaders of the party of the Mountain. Brissot, Condorcet, Vernillot, Godet, Gerson, Pétion, Lassours, Barbaroux headed the party of the Gironde. The two parties were equally hostile to the Bourbons and the Royalists. The men of the first were distinguished for superior energy, those of the second for superior talents. They were both the partisans of a republican establishment. The mountaineers were desirous of a republic for the purpose of destroying what was in existence before the Revolution, both men and things. The Girondists were animated by the infatuation of youthful feeling, which presented at once Athens and Rome to their view and brought back the remembrance of sublime antiquity. The existence of the mountaineers may be dated from the time of the Constituent Assembly. They were the firebrands of the club, so generally known by the name of Jacobin. The insurrection of the Field of Mars was planned by them. This party did not obtain admission into the Constituent and Legislative Assemblies. The Girondists, who predominated in the legislative, were hostile to the Constitution of 1794 and to the king. They would not undertake his defense and suffered him to be sacrificed to the efforts of the Mountain, which, however, was also their enemy. It was the mountaineers who caused the atrocities of the 20th of June, of the 10th of August, and of the 2nd of September. They had then no party in the assembly, but they compelled the Girondists to join them after the victory. The first era of the convention presents the struggle of the Girondists and the mountaineers. The Girondists prevailed at that time in consequence of their superior talents, eloquence, and their already acquired reputation. The presidents were nearly all Girondists. They charged the Mountain with the design of destroying the National Assembly and substituting in its place a Parisian dictatorship. They also reproached it with the massacre of September, etc. The Mountain, in its turn, charged them with wishing for a federative republic like Switzerland, with being hostile to the capital, with having without cause placed the Republic in a state of warfare with the whole of Europe. The Mountain had at its command the Jacobins of Paris and the greatest part of the popular societies of the Republic. The Commune of Paris, the sections of Revolutionary Tribunal, and the lower classes of the people of the capital were devoted to its interests. The Girondists possessed great influence over the departments in general and the enlightened part of the nation. The partisans were more numerous among the upper class of society. The Girondists, who had occupied the left side in the Legislative Assembly and had shown such animosity against the king, the ministers, and the right side or moderate party, were forced to shift places and become in their turn the right side or moderate party, opposed to the vehement, overbearing Mountain, which henceforth formed the left side. The Mountaineers, working on the plan they had adopted under the Constituent Assembly, enlisted all the passions in this service and demanded with loud cries the death of the king. The Girondists might, by openly defending him, have preserved his life. They had recourse to the singular system of condemning him, and after having thus destroyed the monarchy, they wished to sentence to be confirmed by an appeal to the people. In other words, they wished to destroy France by the horrors of a civil war. This false combination of views opened their ruin. Vergniaud, one of the pillars of their party, pronounced the sentence of death upon the king. The Girondists were so powerful in the assembly that several months of labor and several days of insurrection were necessary to destroy their influence in the convention. This party would have governed the convention and crushed the Mountain had its system of conduct been more direct and candid. The metaphysicians had too weighty a preponderance in it. The second era of the convention is the reign of the Mountain. 22 of the principal Girondists perished on the scaffold or fell by their own hands. 73 were thrown into prisons. The Mountain ruled with absolute power. It created the revolutionary government, and the convention in a mass placed itself of its own accord under the yoke of the Committee of Public Safety and of the Revolutionary Tribunal. In this second era, the sittings of the convention no longer resembled those of the first. There was an end of discussion and of liberty. It was the despotism of the Decemvirs. Some of the deputies governed the Committee of General Security of Finance. Others were dispatched by the Committee of Public Safety to the armies and the departments and became real proconsuls. Every month, every week, every day, the government became more ferocious and sanguinary. All those in the higher classes of society who had not emigrated were heaped together in prison as objects of suspicion and sent by hundreds to the scaffold. After treating in this way everyone who was of a noble family, a priest, a merchant, or a considerable proprietor, the excesses of the party recoiling upon itself, it ruled the Jacobins and the Commune of Paris. With an iron hand, it enslaved the convention and threatened it with absolute annihilation. It preached up atheism and prescribed the arts, the sciences, and every species of talent. The artists and men of science were thrown into prison as objects of suspicion, and there was a time when the National Library and the Garden of Plants were on the point of being burnt and laid waste. Robespierre and Danton, struck with indignation at these outrages, united their efforts to put a stop to the frightful progress of popular madness. The Capuchin, Chabot, Bazire, Fabre, d'Eglantine, Herbert, Chaumet, Vincent, and all their associates perished on the scaffold. For the first time since the commencement of the revolution, the people saw persons put to death as ultra-revolutionary, and no longer as having wished to stop the revolution. Their ideas were turned upside down and underwent a real revolution. The prisoners were filled with sans-culottes and with all that was basest in society. It was remarked that the apostate priests were numerous in that class. The people beheld without surprise and with joy the punishment of those who had until then governed them. And that feeling was the revolution which escaped the observation of Robespierre and Danton, and which they knew not how to convert to their advantage. The third era presents a spectacle different from the other two. Danton and Robespierre easily stopped the revolution and put a period to the power of the Commune of Paris, but after their success, they fell out between themselves. Danton, Camille Desmoulins, Hérault de Seychelles, and Lacroix were desirous of going a step farther and putting an end to the assassinations of the Revolutionary Tribunal. Danton and Lacroix had enriched themselves in their mission to Belgium. Camille Desmoulins, who from the beginning of the revolution had given himself the title of Attorney General of the Lanterne, was captivated and softened down by a young wife. They had the boldness to demand that the blow which had been just struck against Hébert or the rest of Marat's party should be turned to the benefit of the whole republic, that no innocent person should in future be condemned, that the system of terror should be abolished, and that a committee of clemency should be established. Biot, Varenne, and Collot who took the lead in the Committee of Public Safety, and among the great body of Jacobins rejected these demands with indignation and fury. And Robespierre, after some hesitation, did not dare to second Danton and made a sacrifice of him. Danton, Camille de Moulin, Hérault de Sechau, perished on the scaffold, to which they were dragged by the whole Committee of Public Safety and by the enraged Jacobins. The people were struck with consternation and for the first time expressed no sign of satisfaction. What Robespierre, however, had not dared to do, and what he could have easily effected had he supported Danton, he had the presumption to undertake after the death of Danton. In order to put a period to atheism, he caused the existence of God to be proclaimed, and he endeavored to reinstate the virtues, the sciences, and arts. Biot, Varenne, Coe, Derbois, and Barrère were struck with horror at seeing the termination of the revolutionary government. They formed a coalition with all the representatives who in their missions had caused the effusion of human blood, and with all the numerous friends whom Danton had in the convention, such as Tallien, Fréron, Legendre. And when Robespierre was bold enough to give a glimpse of his plan for suppressing the administration of the proconsuls and for the necessity of bringing to justice the base characters who had rendered the revolution odious in the provinces, he was consigned to the scaffold. The transactions of the 9th Thermidor constituted in reality the triumph of Cote d'Arbois and Biot, Varenne, men more horrible and bloodthirsty than Robespierre, but that victory should not be obtained over the Jacobins and the Commune, but by calling into action the whole of the citizens, so that with respect to the middling classes and the people, the death of Robespierre was the death of the revolutionary government, and after various oscillations, those who wished to continue the system of terror and had sacrificed Robespierre, as he had sacrificed Danton, because he was desirous of softening down and moderating the revolution, found themselves drawn along with and governed by the public opinion. During the last 10 months, Robespierre frequently complained that he was rendered odious by having all the massacres which were perpetrated attributed to him. The men who caused his destruction were more sanguinary and dreadful than he, but the whole nation, which had for a long time imputed all the assassinations to Robespierre, exclaimed that it was a triumph over tyranny, and that belief put an end to it. Here the dictation ended. The emperor joined in common conversation, and as he never resumed it, we are deprived of the fourth era. June 13th, the emperor had just run over a great many numbers of the moniteurs. These moniteurs said he's so terrible and dangerous to so many reputations are uniformly useful and favorable to me alone. It is with official documents that men of sense and real talents will write history. Now these documents are full of the spirit of my government, and to them I make an earnest and solemn appeal. He added that he had made the moniteur the soul and lifeblood of his government, and that it was the intermediate instrument of his communications with public opinion, both abroad and at home. Every government had since followed his example, more or less in that respect. Whatever serious fault might be committed by any of the high functionaries employed in the interior, immediately, said the emperor, an inquiry was set on foot by 3 councillors of state. They made their report to me, in which they ascertained the facts and discussed the principles. For my own part, I had nothing more to do than to write at the bottom, dispatched for execution according to the laws of the Republic or of the Empire. My interference was at an end. The public result accomplished, and popular opinion did justice to the transaction. It was the most formidable and dreadful of my tribunals. Did any question arise abroad respecting certain grand political combinations or some delicate point of diplomacy? The objects were indirectly hinted at in the moniteur. They instantly attracted universal attention and became the topics of general investigation. This conduct was at once an orderly signal for the adherents of the throne and an appeal for all parties to public opinion. The moniteur has been reproached for the acrimony and virulence of its notes against the enemy. But before we condemn them, we are bound to take into consideration the benefits they may have produced. The anxiety with which they occasionally perplexed the enemy, the terror with which they struck a hesitating cabinet, the stimulus which they gave to our allies, the confidence and audacity with which they inspired our troops. The conversation next turned upon the liberty of the press, and the emperor asked her opinions. We talked for a long time very idly on the subject and threw out a great number of commonplace ideas. Some were hostile to it. Nothing, said they, can resist the liberty of the press. It is capable of overthrowing every government, of agitating every society, of destroying every reputation. It is only observed others. It's prohibition that is dangerous. If it be restricted, it becomes a mine that must explode. But if left to itself, it is merely an unbent bow that can inflict no wound. Here the emperor observed that he was far from being convinced with regard to that point, but that it was no longer the question for consideration, that there were institutions at present, and the liberty of the press was among the number, on the excellence of which we were no longer called upon to decide, but solely to determine the possibility of withholding them from the overbearing influence of popular opinion. He declared that the prohibition under a representative government was a gross anachronism, a downright absurdity. He had therefore, on his return from the Isle of Elba, abandoned the press to all its successes, and he was well assured that they had in no respect contributed to his recent downfall. When it was proposed in council in his presence to discuss the means of sheltering the authority of the state from its attacks, he pleasantly remarked, "Gentlemen, it is probably yourselves you wish to protect, for with respect to me, I shall henceforth continue a stranger to all proceedings. The press has exhausted itself upon me during my absence, and I now heartily defy it to produce anything new or provoking against me." June 14th. The emperor had been ill the whole of the night and continued so during the day. He had a bath for his feet and was not inclined to go out. He dined alone in his apartment and sent for me towards the evening. The emperor began the conversation, of which the constant subject was the Spanish War. It had been seen in the notice, which I have already taken note of, that the emperor took upon himself the whole blame of the measure. I wish to avoid repetitions as much as possible, and shall therefore allude to those topics only which appear new to me. The old king and queen, said the emperor, at the moment of the event, were the objects of the hatred and contempt of their subjects. The prince of the Asturias conspired against them, forced them to abdicate, and at once united in his own person the love and hopes of the nation. That nation was, however, ripe for great changes and demanded them with energy. I enjoyed vast popularity in the country, and it was in that state of things that all these personages met at Bayonne, the old king calling upon me for vengeance against his son, and the young prince soliciting my protection against his father and imploring a wife at my hands. I resolved to convert this singular occasion to my advantage, with the view of freeing myself from that branch of the Bourbons, continuing in my own dynasty the family system of Louis XIV, and of binding Spain to the destinies of France. Ferdinand was sent to Valence, the old king of Marseille, as he wished, and my brother Joseph went to reign at Madrid with liberal constitution adopted by a junta of the Spanish nation, which had come to receive it at Bayonne. It seems to me, continued he, that Europe, and even France, has never had a just idea of Ferdinand's situation at Valence. There is a strange misunderstanding in the world with respect to the treatment he experienced, and still more so with respect to his wishes and personal opinions. As to that situation, the fact is that he was scarcely guarded at Valence, and that he did not wish to escape if any plots were contrived to favor his evasion. He was the first to make them known. An Irishman, Baron de Coley, gained access to his person and offered in the name of George III to carry him off. But Ferdinand, far from embracing the offer, instantly communicated it to the proper authority. His applications to me for a wife at my hands were incessant. He spontaneously wrote to me letters of congratulation upon every event that occurred in my favor. He had addressed proclamations to the Spaniards recommending their submission. He had recognized Joseph. All these were circumstances which might indeed have been considered as forced upon him, but he requested from him the insignia of his grand order. He tendered to me the services of his brother Don Carlos to take the command of the Spanish regiments which which were marching to Russia, proceedings to which he was in no respect obliged. To sum up all, he earnestly solicited my permission to visit my court in Paris, and if I did not lend myself to a spectacle which would have astonished Europe by displaying the full consolidation of my power, it was because the important circumstances which called me abroad and my frequent absence from the capital deprived me of the proper opportunity. Towards the beginning of the new year, at one of the levees, I happened to be next to the Chamberlain, Count d'Arberg, who had been doing duty at Valence, near the persons of the princes of Spain. When the emperor approached, he inquired if these princes conducted themselves with propriety, and added, "You have brought me a very pretty letter, but between ourselves, it was you that wrote it for him." D'Arberg assured him that he was altogether unacquainted even with the nature of its contents. "Well," said the emperor, "a son could not write more cordially to his father. When our situation in Spain," observed the emperor, "turned out dangerous, I more than once proposed to Ferdinand to return and reign over his people, that we should openly carry on war against each other, and that the contest should be decided by the fate of arms." "No," answered the prince, who seems to have been well advised and never deviated from that way of thinking. "My country is agitated by political disturbances. I should but multiply its embarrassments. I might become their victim and lose my head upon the scaffold. I remain, but if you will choose a wife for me, if you will grant me your protection and the support of your arms, I shall set out and prove a faithful ally." At a later period, during our disasters and towards the end of 1813, I yielded to that proposal, and Ferdinand's marriage with Joseph's eldest daughter was decided. But circumstances were then no longer the same, and Ferdinand was desirous that the marriage should be deferred. "You can no longer," he observed, "support me with your arms, and I ought not to make my wife a title of exclusion in the eyes of my people." "He left me," continued the emperor, "as it seemed, with every intention of good faith, for he remained faithful to the principles which he avowed in his departure until the events of Fontainebleau." The emperor assured us that had the affairs of 1814 turned out differently, he would unquestionably have accomplished his marriage with Joseph's daughter. The emperor, in reverting to these affairs, said that the impolicy of his conduct was irrevocably decided by the results, but that independently of that kind of proof depending upon consequences, he had to reproach himself with serious faults in the execution of his plans. One of the greatest was that of treating the dethronement of the dynasty of the Bourbons as a matter of importance, and of maintaining as a basis of a system for its successor was precisely the man who by his qualities and character was certain to produce its failure. During the assembly at Bayonne, Ferdinand's former preceptor and his principal counselor, Escouquis, at once perceiving the vast projects entertained by the emperor and pleading the cause of his master, said to him, "You wish to create for yourself a kind of Herculean labor? When you have but child's play in hand, you wish to rid yourselves of the Bourbons of Spain. Why should you be apprehensive of them? They have ceased to exist. They are no longer French. You have nothing to fear from them. They are altogether aliens with respect to your nation and your manners. You have here Madame de Montmorency and some new ladies of your court. They are not more acquainted with the one than with the other, and view them all with equal indifference." The emperor unfortunately formed a different resolution. I took the liberty of telling him I had been assured by some Spaniards that if the national pride had been respected and the Spanish junta held at Madrid instead of Bayonne, or even if Charles IV had been sent off and Ferdinand retained, the revolution would have been popular and affairs would have taken another turn. The emperor entertained no doubt of it and agreed that the enterprise had been imprudently undertaken and that many circumstances might have been better conducted. Charles IV said he was, however, too stale for the Spaniards. Ferdinand should have been considered in the same light. The plan most worthy of me and the best suited to my project would have been a kind of mediation like that of Switzerland. I ought to have given a liberal constitution to the Spanish nation and charged Ferdinand with its execution. If he acted with good faith, Spain must have prospered and harmonized with our new manners. The great object would have been obtained, and France would have acquired an intimate ally, and in addition to power truly formidable. Had Ferdinand, on the contrary, proved faithless to his new engagements, the Spaniards themselves would not have failed to dismiss him and would have applied to me for a ruler in his place. At all events, concluded the emperor, that unfortunate war of Spain was a real affliction and the first cause of calamities in France. After my conferences at Erfurt with Alexander, England ought to have been compelled to make peace by the force of arms or of reason. She had lost the esteem of the continent. Her attack upon Copenhagen had disgusted the public mind, while I distinguished myself at that moment by every contrary advantage. When that disastrous affair of Spain presented itself to effect a sudden change against me and reinstate England in public opinion, she was enabled from that moment to continue the war. The trade with South America was thrown open to her. She formed an army for herself in the peninsula and next became the victorious agent, the main point of all the plots which were hatched on the continent. All this affected my ruin. I was then assailed with imputations for which, however, I had given no cause. History will do me justice. I was charged in that affair with perfidy, with laying snares, with bad faith, and yet I was completely innocent. Never, whatever may have been said to the contrary, have I broken any engagement or violated my promise, either with regard to Spain or any other power. The world will one day be convinced that in the principal transactions relative to Spain, I was completely a stranger to all the domestic intrigues of its court, that I broke no promise made either to Charles IV or Ferdinand VII, that I violated no engagement with the father or the son, that I made use of no falsehoods to entice them both to Bayonne, but that they both strove which should be the first to show themselves there. When I saw them at my feet and was enabled to form a correct opinion of their total incapacity, I beheld with compassion the fate of a great people. I eagerly seized the singular opportunity held out to me by fortune for regenerating Spain, rescuing her from the yoke of England, and intimately uniting her with our system. It was, in my conception, laying the fundamental basis of the tranquility and security of Europe. But I was far from employing for that purpose, as it has been reported, any base and paltry stratagems. If I erred, it was, on the contrary, by daring openness and extraordinary energy. Bayonne was not the scene of premeditated ambush, but of a vast masterstroke of state policy. I could have preserved myself from these imputations by a little hypocrisy or by giving up the Prince of the Peace to the fury of the people, but the idea appeared horrible to me and struck me as if I was to receive the price of blood. Besides, it must also be acknowledged that Murat did me a great deal of mischief in the whole affair. Be that as it may, I disdain having recourse to crooked and commonplace expedients. I found myself so powerful, I dared to strike from a situation too exalted. I wish to act like Providence, which of its own accord applies remedies to the wretchedness of mankind by means occasionally violent, but for which it is unaccountable to human judgment. I candidly confess, however, that I engaged very inconsiderately in the whole of the affair. Its immorality must have shown himself too openly, its injustice too glaringly, and the transactions taken altogether present a disgusting aspect, more particularly since my failure, for the outrage is no longer seen, but in its hideous nakedness, stripped of all loftiness in idea and of the numerous benefits which it was my intention to confer. Posterity, however, would have extolled it had I succeeded, and perhaps with reason, on account of its vast and happy results. Such is our lot, and such our judgment in this world. But I once more declare that in no instance was there any breach of faith, any perfidy or falsehood, and what is more, there was no occasion for them. Here the emperor resumed in its totality and principle the historical sketch of the affair respecting Spain, repeating many things which have been already noticed.